Part 1. The shotgun came down hard against the side of her head. Not a warning swing, not a shove. A full strike, metal against skull. And the sound of it cut through the fluorescent hum of the emergency corridor like a crack of dry wood. Nurse Mara Tollens hit the wall and slid down it, and the man holding the weapon didn't even look at her twice. He was already moving, already barking orders, already certain she was nothing. A 29-year-old in blue scrubs with blood running into her ear and her hands pressed flat against the floor. Nobody in that hallway moved to help her. They were all too busy being afraid. Before you go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not see coming. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Cascade Valley Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Drover Falls, Montana, in that particular way that smaller regional hospitals tend to sit, not quite in the city, not quite outside it, occupying a stretch of Highway 9 between a tire shop and an irrigation supply warehouse. It had 214 beds, 2 functioning elevators out of 3, a cafeteria that closed at 8, and a night staff that ran thin from 11 onward. The parking lot lights had been flickering for 6 weeks. Facilities had submitted the repair request twice. The third request was still sitting in someone's inbox. It was the kind of place that got the job done, mostly, and that's the nicest thing anyone who worked there would say about it. Mara Tollens had been on staff for 14 months. She came in from somewhere. Nobody was entirely sure where, she didn't talk much about it, took the night shift without complaint, and settled into a quiet, methodical rhythm that her coworkers found either impressive or irritating, depending on who you asked. She was fast with an IV line. She was good with the difficult patients, the ones who came in yelling or crying or both. She didn't flinch at blood. She also didn't talk about herself, which in a hospital the size of Cascade Valley was practically a social offense. "She's got that 1,000-yard thing," one of the ER techs, a guy named Denny Marsh, once told a colleague. "Like she's always somewhere else in her head." "Probably just tired," his colleague said. "Nah," Denny shook his head. "It's something else." Nobody pursued it. There were enough living problems to manage without borrowing someone else's history. Mara showed up, did her work, and went home. That was enough. Except it wasn't, really, for a particular subset of the senior staff. Dr. Hadley Voss, the head of emergency medicine, had made his position clear in Mara's first month without ever saying anything directly, which was its own kind of statement. He would redirect patients away from her when he could. He reviewed her charts with a thoroughness he didn't apply to anyone else. When she offered an assessment in morning handoffs, he would listen with his arms crossed and then repeat, almost verbatim, what she'd just said, as if the idea needed to come from him to count. "You're going to hit a ceiling here," her charge nurse, a veteran woman named Betty Okafor, warned her once, quietly, in the supply closet. Betty was 53, had been at Cascade Valley for 20 years, and had the kind of institutional memory that made her either invaluable or dangerous, depending on who was in administration that year. Voss decides who moves up, and Voss doesn't move people he doesn't understand. "I'm not trying to move up," Mara said, pulling a fresh roll of trauma tape from the shelf. "Everybody says that," Bet told her, "right up until they want to." Mara didn't answer. She tucked the tape into her scrub pocket and went back to work. What Betty didn't know, what nobody at Cascade Valley knew, was that Mara Tollens had spent 6 years in the United States Army as a combat medic. 2 deployments. The second one lasted 11 months and took her through terrain that she still sometimes saw when she closed her eyes at the wrong moment. She had treated gunshot wounds in the dark with equipment held together by electrical tape and willpower. She had made calls under fire that no medical textbook had prepared her for, and that no civilian licensing board would ever ask about. She had come home with a handful of decorations she kept in a shoebox under her bed, and a very precise understanding of what mattered and what didn't. What didn't matter, she had decided, was being respected by people who hadn't earned the right to disrespect her. She could wait them out. She was good at waiting. That decision had served her fine for 14 months. Then the 3rd Thursday of November arrived, and everything she'd been patient about stopped being relevant. The shift started at 11. Mara clocked in, checked the board, and took her section, beds 4 through 9 in the main ER bay, plus overflow responsibility for the trauma hallway if it got busy. The overnight census was light. 2 chest pain evaluations, 1 laceration from a woodworking accident, 1 elderly woman with a UTI who'd been brought in by a neighbor. Standard stuff, the kind of night where you drank bad coffee and caught up on charting and tried not to think too hard about anything. At 11:40, a 22-year-old nursing intern named Garrett Spence was working his 3rd overnight rotation. He was good, genuinely good, with the kind of instincts that either came naturally or didn't. But he was also young enough that confidence and anxiety lived in him in roughly equal measure. He'd been assigned to shadow Mara, which he'd been quietly relieved about because she was the one staff member who didn't talk down to him.
"How do you stay so calm?" he asked her around midnight while they were restocking a cart. Mara glanced at him. "Practice. Like, you just get used to it?" "No," she said. "You don't get used to it. You just get faster at filing it away." Garrett turned this over. "That sounds kind of terrible, honestly." "It has its uses," she said. She wasn't being dismissive. She meant it. The ability to tuck things into temporary storage, to register the weight of a moment without letting it slow you down, had kept her functional in places where falling apart wasn't an option. It was a skill like any other. You trained it. You maintained it. You paid the cost later, privately, in ways you figured out as you went. At 12:17, a call came through from triage. A man had walked in off the street with a hand laceration from broken glass, disoriented and uncooperative. Mara took it. She got him into a bed, assessed the cut, deep but clean, no tendon involvement, and started the irrigation process while talking him down from whatever edge he was on. He was a little drunk, a little scared. He didn't want to be touched. "I know," she told him, her voice level. "I'm going to be quick. You're going to feel a pull and then pressure. Tell me if it's too much." He told her twice that it was too much. She slowed down both times and then kept going, and by the time she was placing the second suture, he had stopped fighting and was watching the ceiling with the particular exhausted resignation of a man who had given up arguing with competence. That was 12:40. At 1:06, the front doors of the emergency entrance opened and 3 men walked in. Mara was at the nursing station, her back half turned when the shift in the room's atmosphere hit her first, before she saw anything, before she heard anything. 14 months of night shifts and 6 years of military training had given her a particular sensitivity to the moment when a space changes. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a sound, it was pressure, a change in how the air felt. She turned. 2 of the men were dressed in work jackets and jeans. The third was wearing a hooded sweatshirt. They spread out as they crossed the threshold, not the movement of people looking for help, but of people who had thought about lines of sight. The one in the hoodie reached the reception desk in 4 steps and pulled a sawed-off shotgun from under his jacket before the intake coordinator, a woman named Priya Anand, had finished processing what she was seeing. "Nobody moves," he said. "Nobody talks. You do exactly what I tell you and we're all home before sunrise." His voice was flat. Practiced. The kind of flat that came from having done this before or from having told himself he would be flat when the time came and then finding out he was right. The second man produced a handgun from his waistband and positioned himself between the waiting area and the hallway to the main bay. 3 patients in the waiting area, the woodworking man's wife, an older gentleman who'd been there when Mara arrived, and a teenage girl with her mother, went rigid in their seats. The third man moved toward the nursing station. Mara stepped back. Not out of fear. She stepped back because stepping forward would have been the wrong signal, and she needed a few seconds to read what she was dealing with. Her hands came up slightly, palms open. She made her expression go soft and uncertain, because soft and uncertain was what this man was expecting to see, and giving people what they expected kept them from looking harder. "Where's the pharmacy access?" the third man demanded. He was shorter than the other 2, with a redness around his eyes that suggested either exhaustion or stimulants. His hands were moving in that particular nervous way, not trembling, but restless, the kind of energy that had nowhere to go. "Secured storage." "Where is it?" I'm just a nurse," Mara said. Her voice came out small and unsteady, which required essentially no effort because she'd heard what small and unsteady sounded like approximately 10,000 times and could reproduce it on demand.
I don't have the access codes. Who does? The charge nurse. Bet. She might be in the back. The man looked at her for a long moment. He was trying to decide if she was a problem. He decided she wasn't. That decision was going to cost him. Behind her, she could hear Garrett Spence's breathing. Too fast, too shallow. Somewhere between controlled panic and the kind of fear that made people do things they'd regret. She turned slightly, just enough to make eye contact with him without being obvious about it, and gave him the smallest possible signal, a fractional dip of her chin. Stay still. Don't do anything. Wait. She didn't know if he'd understand it. She had to hope. The man with the shotgun, the one in the hoodie who seemed to be running this, was directing staff toward the back wall of the triage area. His voice stayed flat and controlled, which was both professional and bad news. Controlled people didn't panic into mistakes as easily. I need the pharmacy supervisor and the charge nurse at the dispensary entrance in 3 minutes, he said, addressing the room. If they're not there, I start making problems. Priya Anand, behind the reception desk, was trying to press a silent alarm. Mara watched her fingers find the button and press it 3 times. She couldn't know if it had connected. The hospital's security system had been glitching for 2 weeks. What she did know was that even if it had connected, response time from the county sheriff's substation was 11 minutes minimum, probably 15 at this hour. A lot could happen in 15 minutes. The man with the nervous hands found Betty Okafor in the medication room off the main corridor. Mara heard the encounter before she saw it. Bet's voice, sharp and controlled, and then a crash as something was knocked off a shelf, and then silence. When they came back into the hallway, Bet had her hands raised and her jaw set in a way that meant she was furious and choosing not to show it. She needs the access code from someone else, the man said. I'm telling you, I can't open it alone, Bet said. The system requires 2-person authentication. Then find the second person. The second person is Dr. Voss, and he's not here tonight. This was true. Voss had gone home at 10. The on-call attending was Dr. Lena Park, who was currently in surgery on the 2nd floor with a trauma case that had come in before the shift change, a car accident victim who'd coded twice and was still unstable. The man looked at the second man with the handgun. Something passed between them. Who else can open it? The man with the shotgun said, directing the question at the room. I'm going to ask once. Nobody answered. He moved to Garrett Spence and pressed the shotgun barrel against Garrett's collarbone. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a word. His face went white. Wait, Mara said. Every head turned toward her. She kept her voice controlled, her posture slightly collapsed, still playing the woman who was scared, who was trying to help, who just wanted this to be over. There's a secondary authorization credential. Dr. Park has it. She's in surgery, but she has a tablet with remote access. If you let me go get it, you're not going anywhere, the man said. I'm not trying to run, Mara said. I'm trying to keep you from having to hurt someone. She let her eyes go to Garrett, deliberately, and then back. He's a student. He doesn't know anything. There's no reason to put a gun on him when I can actually solve your problem. Another pause. The man with the shotgun looked at her, really looked, for the first time, and whatever he saw, he decided she was manageable, an anxious, helpful woman trying to make the bad things stop. Fine, he said. You go. He comes with me. He gestured toward Garrett, who was breathing in sharp, shallow increments. Mara looked at Garrett again. His eyes found hers, and she saw the fear in them. Genuine, unfiltered, the kind you couldn't prepare for the first time it happened. She gave him the same signal as before, the small dip of her chin, and this time she saw something register in his face. Not calm, not certainty, but a decision to trust her, which was the most she could ask for. She turned and walked toward the door to the surgical corridor. In her head, she was already running through what she knew. 3 men, 2 firearms confirmed, the shotgun and the handgun. The third man might have a weapon she hadn't seen. The nervous one was volatile but trying to hold it together. The shotgun man was steady but not unshakable. The third was the unknown, and unknowns were what got you. She needed to know where all 3 were before she did anything. She also needed a minute, because she was still deciding how bad this was going to have to get. The surgical floor was quiet. The elevator opened onto a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, lit by the particular blue-white of institutional fluorescence that made everyone look slightly ill. Mara walked it quickly, her footsteps soft, cataloging everything: exits, obstacles, objects. She didn't go to find Dr. Park's tablet. She went to the supply closet at the end of the corridor. Inside, behind 2 boxes of saline bags and a broken IV pole that had been waiting for maintenance since August, there was a secondary emergency kit, the kind that trauma centers kept in secondary positions for mass casualty scenarios. She'd found it her second week on the job because she always looked for them, because that habit had been drilled into her until it was reflex. She opened it, checked the contents, and made 3 decisions in about 4 seconds. When she came back down the corridor, the third man, the one she hadn't fully read yet, was waiting at the elevator. He was broader than she'd registered, and he was holding a hunting knife in a loose grip that suggested he'd used one before. His eyes moved over her in that assessment way, looking for threat, and found nothing that concerned him. "He sent you back?" he said. "I couldn't get into the surgical unit," Mara said. "It's locked down during active procedures. I told him that, but he wanted me to try." The man studied her. "What's in your pocket?" She had nothing in her pocket. She kept her expression confused. "What?" "Your scrub pocket. It's full." It was. She had the medical shears, a packaged tourniquet, and a coil of sterile tubing. None of it was in any way threatening to someone who didn't know what it could be used for. "Supplies," she said. "I grabbed them when I was up there." "Habit." He looked at her for another beat and then stepped aside. "Move." She walked past him. As she did, she put her left hand against the wall as if steadying herself, a gesture of fatigue completely unremarkable, and in the same motion registered his knife hand at roughly 8 o'clock from her position, his center of mass, the distance between them. 41 inches, 3 steps. She filed it and kept walking. Back in the ER, things had shifted while she was gone. The nervous man had moved the waiting room patients into the main bay, which was both worse and better. Worse because it consolidated the vulnerable people in a space with limited exits. Better because it brought everyone into a position Mara could actually work with. Betty Okafor was sitting against the wall with her arms around a frightened elderly patient. Priya Anand was in the corner, her phone removed, her eyes moving between the 2 armed men with the particular alertness of someone who was thinking and didn't want to show it. Garrett was still standing. He was still white, but his breathing had slowed, and when Mara walked back in, he tracked her with his eyes without being obvious about it. "Good kid." "Well?" the shotgun man said. "The access code requires Dr. Park's biometric confirmation," Mara said. "The tablet won't work remotely. She has to be physically at the terminal." He was not happy about this. His jaw tightened and he moved toward her, and Mara held very still, keeping her posture submissive, her eyes down. "Then we wait," he said. "The surgery could take another 2 hours," she said quietly. "Then we wait 2 hours. The patients aren't my problem." He stopped a foot from her, close enough that she could hear the tension in his breathing. "You're going to stop talking now, and you're going to sit down with everyone else, and you're going to be very, very quiet. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Mara said. She sat down. She sat down next to Garrett, whose knee was shaking slightly, and she put her back against the wall and looked straight ahead at the 2 armed men and the third one stationed at the corridor entrance, and she began the work of being invisible. After about 30 seconds, Garrett leaned slightly toward her. "What do we do?" he breathed, barely audible. Mara didn't move her head. Her voice came out at a level that was technically a whisper but felt like nothing at all in the ambient noise of the room. Ventilation, the soft crying of the older woman, the crackle of a radio one of the men was checking. "We wait," she said. "For what?" She didn't answer right away. She was watching the nervous man's hands. He'd been rotating the handgun in his grip for the past 2 minutes, a habit, probably unconscious. Every 3rd or 4th rotation, his grip loosened slightly on the backstrap. "For the right moment," she said. Garrett was quiet. Then after a beat, "Do you know what you're doing?" Mara looked at him then, briefly, sideways. "Yes," she said. There was something in her voice that she hadn't intended. Not reassurance, not performance, just a flat certainty that came from a place most 22-year-olds had never had to visit. Garrett stared at her for a moment, and she watched him process it. Watched something shift in his expression from fear to something less certain but more focused. She turned back to the room. The nervous man had moved to the window. The shotgun man was near the dispensary hallway. The third man was behind her. She needed the third man in front of her. She needed 30 seconds. She needed the nervous man's handgun to rotate one more time into that loose grip position. She had been in worse spots than this. She had been in places where the margin for error was not 30 seconds, but 3, where the equipment she had available was a headlamp and a tourniquet and her own 2 hands, where the people counting on her couldn't be told to sit tight because they were unconscious or worse. She had come home from those places. She would handle this. At 1:22 in the morning, the nervous man's radio crackled and a voice said, "Tanner, what's your status?" And the nervous man, Tanner, pulled the radio up with his right hand and transferred the gun to his left, and the grip was loose. And Mara was already moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She came off the wall in one motion, crossing the distance in 3 fast steps, her right hand catching his gun wrist and driving it upward as her left hand closed over the weapon in a disarming grip she'd done so many times under so many conditions that it happened below the level of thought. The gun came free. She rotated it, stepped behind him, and had his arm locked at the elbow before he finished understanding what was happening. "Don't," she said to the room, to the other 2 men who were already reacting. She had the gun up. Her voice was not small anymore. It was not unsteady. "Put them down, both of you, right now." The shotgun man raised his weapon. Mara pulled Tanner tighter against her, not as a shield, but as leverage, and kept the gun level and kept her voice steady. "You came here for drugs," she said. "You didn't come here to shoot a federal—" The shotgun man fired. Not at her. High and left. A warning shot that punched through the ceiling tile and rained white composite dust down on the terrified cluster of patients against the far wall. Someone screamed. Garrett dropped to the floor, pulling the elderly woman down with him, which was the right call, and Mara filed it with the small part of her brain that was still tracking who was where. The shotgun was now discharged on one barrel. The third man came through the corridor entrance behind her, 41 inches, 3 steps. Except this time she was ready for him. She released Tanner, dropped low, and came up under the knife hand with the medical shears open, not to cut, but to trap, the blade locked between the shear handles. Leveraged sideways with a torque that forced his wrist into an angle that the human joint simply would not sustain. The knife hit the floor. She kept his wrist, kept the torque, and walked him into the wall face first with a momentum that ended the exchange in about 2 seconds. Tanner scrambled for the gun she'd dropped. Garrett Spence from the floor got there first. He didn't pick it up. He kicked it, hard, sideways, and sent it spinning under a wheeled cart and then stayed down, which was absolutely the right decision, and Mara registered it and moved. The shotgun man was reloading. She was across the room before the second shell seated. The barrel came up and she was inside its arc, her left forearm driving the muzzle wide while her right palm came up hard under his chin. Not a strike designed to hurt exactly, but one designed to interrupt, to buy half a second, which was all she needed to get a hand on the weapon and redirect the discharge into the floor between them. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed space. Her ears were going to be ringing for a week. The shotgun man sat down. Not because she'd incapacitated him, she hadn't quite, but because the force of the discharge had driven the stock back into his shoulder at an angle he hadn't braced for, and the combination of that and the palm strike had taken his legs out from under him. He sat against the wall and looked up at her with an expression that was something between fury and a kind of stunned recalibration. "It's over," Mara said. She was breathing hard. Her left ear was still ringing. There was blood on her forehead from where she'd clipped the edge of the cart. She hadn't felt it happen. She only knew because she could feel the warmth moving toward her eyebrow. "You understand me? It's over." From outside, she could hear it now. The sound of sirens, multiple vehicles, close. The room was very still. Tanner was on the floor with his hands over his head. The third man was against the wall, his wrist at an angle that suggested it was no longer functioning correctly. The shotgun man was sitting 3 feet from her, still holding the weapon but not raising it. She didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, her position clear, her intent clear, her eyes on the shotgun man because he was the one who was still a decision away from making this a great deal worse. Garrett was behind her. She could hear him breathing, fast, but controlled now. Controlled in a new way, like someone who had just discovered a gear they didn't know they had. Beta Okafor from the corner said in a voice that was remarkably steady, "Mara." Mara didn't take her eyes off the shotgun man. "I know," she said. The front doors opened. The lights in the parking lot were all working suddenly. Or maybe it was the tactical vehicles parked outside, flooding the entrance with white and red and blue. The shotgun man looked at the lights, looked at her, and then very slowly set the weapon on the floor. Mara stepped back. She reached up and touched her forehead and looked at the blood on her fingertips for a moment, almost absently, the way you notice something you're going to have to deal with, but not right this second. Then the first officer came through the doors at speed with a rifle up and a shouted command filling the room, and Mara raised her empty hands and kept them up and waited. In the chaos of the next 40 seconds, the entries, the shouts, the compliance commands, the sound of hands being cuffed and bodies being placed, nobody looked at her. Nobody registered her as anything other than part of the scene to be processed and secured. Except Garrett, who was on his knees with his hands up, following protocol, and who looked across the room at her with an expression she wouldn't be able to fully describe for a long time after. Like he'd thought he knew what a person could be, and had just found out he was wrong. Mara stood with her hands raised and her face neutral, and the blood moving slowly toward her eyebrow, and she waited for someone to tell her what to do next, and she let them. That was how it worked. You did what needed to be done, and then you stepped back, and then you waited for the world to catch up. She was good at waiting. The first officer through the door was young, late 20s, maybe 30, and he moved the way people moved when adrenaline had been running for a while and hadn't found anywhere to go yet. He swept the room with his rifle, called out a compliance command that bounced off the hard surfaces and came back louder than he intended, and then his eyes landed on Mara and stopped. She was standing with her hands up, blood tracking a slow line from her hairline to the edge of her left eyebrow, and she was the calmest person in the room. "On your knees," he said. She went to her knees without argument. Not because she was afraid of him, she wasn't, but because this was the part where you let the process happen. You didn't shortcut it. You didn't try to explain yourself at the point of a rifle to someone whose nervous system was still deciding whether to shoot. 4 more officers came through in rapid sequence. 2 moved to the suspects. 1 went to the cluster of patients against the wall. The last one, a woman with a sergeant's stripes on her sleeve and a face that suggested she'd been dragged out of bed for this, looked at the room with the practiced efficiency of someone doing a rapid triage. Not medical, but situational. And then her eyes moved to Tanner on the floor, to the 3rd man against the wall with the bad wrist, to the shotgun on the ground 4 feet from where the shooter had been sitting, then back to Mara. "You do this?" she said. "Most of it," Mara said. The intern kicked the gun under the cart. The sergeant looked at Garrett, who was still on his knees, still following compliance protocol, still managing to look simultaneously terrified and fiercely concentrated. "Good instinct," the sergeant said, to nobody in particular. She crouched in front of Mara. Her nameplate read DeLuca. Her eyes were the color of weathered slate, and they were doing the same thing Mara's eyes did when she walked into a new space. Cataloging, measuring, calculating risk. "You're a nurse here?" "Yes." "What's your training?" Mara met her gaze. "Sufficient." DeLuca held the look for a moment. Then something in her jaw shifted. Not softening, exactly, but adjusting. And she stood and waved one of the junior officers over. "Get her up. She's not a suspect." Then to Mara, "I'm going to need a full statement. Don't go far." "I've got patients to check," Mara said. "Check them fast." Mara stood. Her knees were fine. Her ear was still ringing. The shotgun discharge at close range had done something unpleasant to the frequency response on her left side, and she knew from experience that it would take a few days to settle. The cut on her forehead had clotted already, which was good, though it was going to need a couple of sutures before the night was over and she was going to have to ask someone else to put them in, which she already resented. She moved to the cluster of patients first, the waiting room people who'd been herded into the main bay. The elderly woman was shaking but lucid. The man who'd been here with his wife was in shock, clinically speaking, pale, unfocused, breathing too shallow, and Mara talked him through it quietly and efficiently while checking his pulse, getting a blanket over him, flagging Bet to watch his pressure. The teenage girl had a deep bruise forming on her forearm from where one of the men had shoved her into the wall, but no fracture, and her mother was holding her with the particular ferocity of someone who had just spent 20 minutes believing it could have been worse. "You're okay," Mara told the girl. "The bruise is going to look bad tomorrow." "That's normal. It's going to hurt for a week." "That's also normal." The girl nodded. She was maybe 15, trying very hard not to cry and not entirely succeeding. "You did well," Mara said. "Staying still like that. That was the right call." It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was what she had to give right now. She found Garrett near the far wall, talking to one of the officers. He'd gotten up off his knees at some point, and the terror had cycled through him into something that looked like its aftermath, the slightly hollow look of a body that had used up its emergency stores and was now running on nothing in particular. When he saw Mara, he crossed to her immediately. "Are you hurt?" he said. He was looking at her forehead. "It's small. It'll need sutures." "I can—" He stopped. I've only done sutures on a practice model." "I know," she said. "I'll find Park when she's out of surgery." "Mara." He said her name in a way that meant he was trying to figure out how to say something harder. "What? How did you—" "Not right now," she said. "Okay." A beat. "Okay." "Yeah." He was going to have questions. They were going to need answering eventually. She knew that. She filed it under the same category as the sutures and the ringing ear, things that required attention, but not this second. The three men were cuffed and being processed. Tanner was cooperative in the way of someone who had completely run out of options and knew it. The third man, she still didn't have a name for him, was sitting against the wall with his injured wrist in his lap, his face tight with the kind of controlled expression that meant the pain was significant, but he was choosing not to give anyone the satisfaction of knowing it. The shotgun man was being walked toward the entrance by two officers. He turned once, near the door, and looked back at Mara. She looked back at him. He held the look for about 3 seconds, and then the officers moved him through the door, and he was gone. The statement took 40 minutes. Sergeant DeLuca ran it herself in the break room, which had been designated as a secondary interview space because the main ER was now a crime scene with officers working it. She had a recorder and a notepad, and she wrote things down even when the recorder was running, which Mara respected. Redundancy was a good habit. Mara told her what happened in the order it happened without editorializing. The timeline, the positions, the weapons she'd observed, the sequence of her interventions. DeLuca asked clarifying questions in a flat, efficient register, and Mara answered them in the same register. And about halfway through, the sergeant looked up from her notepad with an expression that was hard to read. "You said you assessed their positions before you moved." "Yes." "From the floor, sitting against the wall, with your hands in your lap." "Yes." "While appearing to be just sitting there." "Yes." DeLuca wrote something down. "What's your background, Miss Tollens?" "I'm a registered nurse. I've been on staff here for 14 months. "That's not what I asked." Mara looked at her. "I know." Another pause. DeLuca set her pen down. "You're not obligated to tell me your prior history as part of this statement, but I'm going to ask you directly. Do you have military or law enforcement training?" "Military," Mara said. "I'm not currently active." "What branch?" "Army. MOS. 68 Whiskey. Combat medic." DeLuca's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A recalibration, subtle and fast. "How long?" 6 years, 2 deployments. The sergeant looked at her for a moment. Then she picked her pen back up and wrote something down that took longer than a single word. She didn't say what it was. "Is there anything else relevant to the incident that you haven't told me?" she said. "No." "Okay." DeLuca clicked her recorder off, then on again. "One more thing. For the record, the individual who discharged the firearm, the shot went into the ceiling. But before that happened, you said to him, ha." She checked her notepad. "You said, you didn't come here to shoot a federal, and then the shot occurred. What were you going to say?" Mara was quiet for a moment.
A federal hospital, she said. A federally funded medical facility. The sentencing enhancement for violent crimes at federally funded locations is significantly higher. I was trying to give him a reason to stop that had nothing to do with me. DeLuca looked at her. And you knew that off the top of your head. I'd read the statute, Mara said. The sergeant wrote it down and didn't say anything else.
It was 3:40 in the morning by the time the crime scene work was far enough along that the ER could begin functioning again in a limited capacity. Dr. Lena Park had come down from surgery at some point during the statement. Her patient had stabilized finally, after 2 hours on the table, and she'd been briefed in the hallway by one of the officers. She came to find Mara in the break room after DeLuca left. Park was 44, Korean-American, with the kind of bearing that came from 20 years in surgery and a CV that would intimidate most people at first glance. She had never been anything but professionally neutral with Mara, which in the context of Cascade Valley's internal politics was actually a form of respect. She sat down across the table and looked at the suture kit she'd brought with her. "Let me see," she said. Mara tilted her head. Park examined the laceration. About 2 centimeters, clean edges, and opened the kit without further comment. "You're going to want to hold still," she said. "I know how sutures work," Mara said. "I know you know." Park threaded the needle. "I meant for my benefit. My hands are steady, but I've been in OR for 2 hours, and I'd rather you not twitch on me." Mara held still. Park put in 2 sutures with the kind of economy that came from doing it 10,000 times. Minimal handling, clean placement, no wasted motion. "There," she said. She set the needle down and looked at Mara directly for the first time. "Are you going to tell me what happened in there?" "It'll be in the incident report." "I'm sure it will." Park stripped off her gloves. "That's not what I asked." Mara looked at the table. 3 men came in for controlled substances. I stopped them. "You stopped 3 armed men," Park said. "By yourself, in the middle of a fully occupied ER bay." "Garrett helped." Park made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He kicked a gun under a cart." "That was actually important," Mara said. Silence for a moment. Park was watching her with an expression that was trying to figure something out. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone who had a piece of a puzzle and was realizing the picture was larger than they'd thought. "Mara," she said, "how long were you in?" Mara looked at her. "I was Army," Park said quietly. "Reserves. 8 years. I got out when my residency started, and I never talked about it because this place," she gestured, a small, precise movement that encompassed the entire building and everything in it, "doesn't know how to do anything with that information except use it against you." She paused. "So, how long?" 6 years, Mara said. Park nodded slowly, like something had settled into alignment. "Okay," she said. She stood, gathered the suture kit, and then stopped at the door. "Voss is going to be here at 6. Someone called him when this happened. He's going to have opinions." "Well, he always does," Mara said. "His opinions might be louder than usual this time." "I know." Park looked at her for a moment, and there was something in it, not pity, not admiration, but a kind of acknowledgement that was quieter and more useful than either. "Get some food," she said. "There's something in the vending machine that might technically qualify." She left. Mara sat with the overhead light humming above her and the sutures tight at her hairline and the ringing in her ear that was maybe slightly better than it had been an hour ago. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. The other kind. The kind that accumulated in layers and needed different things. She was aware of it the way she was always aware of it, as a fact of her situation rather than a complaint. She went to the vending machine and got something that claimed to be a granola bar and ate it standing up in the hallway, watching the crime scene techs move through the ER bay with their kits and their quiet professionalism. And she thought about nothing in particular for about 4 minutes. Then Bet Okafor found her. Bet looked like someone who had been through something and had decided not to let it show, which was different from someone who hadn't been through anything. There was a stiffness in her movements, shock wearing off into soreness, the bruise developing on her left forearm from when she'd been shoved in the medication room. She'd refused treatment twice, Mara knew, because she'd watched Bet wave off 2 different officers trying to get her to sit down. "I need to say something to you," Bet said. "Okay. I told you 14 months ago that you were going to hit a ceiling here." Bet was looking at her with an expression that was complicated. Not simple admiration, but something that had more edges to it. Guilt was part of it. Mara recognized it without commenting on it. "I knew you were better than how Voss treated you. I said it to myself. I didn't say it out loud where it would have mattered." "Bet." "Let me finish." Bet's jaw was set. "You didn't need me to defend you tonight. That's obvious. But there have been other nights, smaller things, times when I could have said something and I didn't because it was easier not to." She paused. "That's on me." Mara was quiet. "I don't know what you were before you came here," Bet said. "And I'm not asking, but I know what I've watched for 14 months, and I know what I watched tonight, and I should have been saying out loud what I was thinking privately." She stopped. "That's all." Mara looked at her. Betty Okafor was not an easy woman to read. She'd built up a lot of professional armor over 20 years in this building, and she wore it at all times. What was visible right now was something underneath that, and Mara registered it with a care that was separate from the clinical way she registered most things. "Thank you," Mara said. Betty nodded once, sharp, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she turned and walked back into the corridor, and she was already pulling out her phone, already managing the next thing, already being the person who held the operational reality of Cascade Valley together by sheer will and experience. Mara watched her go. At 5:14, Tanner's wrist was treated in the back bay under guard. 2 compound fractures, probably from when he'd hit the floor during the disarm. Mara wasn't his treating nurse. She was told not to be, by an officer who was being careful about the evidentiary chain of custody, which was correct procedure, and she didn't argue with it. She watched from the hallway while another nurse handled it. At 5:51, a car pulled into the parking lot, and Mara saw, through the exterior glass, Dr. Hadley Voss getting out of it. He was in street clothes, gray slacks, a fleece pullover, his graying hair uncombed in a way that suggested he hadn't fully processed that he was going to be visible before leaving his house. He walked quickly, the way people walked when they were trying to project urgency without running. His face was unreadable from a distance. Mara stepped back from the window. She went to the nursing station and pulled up the current patient board and found 3 things that needed checking and went to check them, because whatever was coming, the best thing she could do was be doing her job when it arrived. She made it about 11 minutes. Then Dr. Voss walked into the main bay, scanned the room, found her at bed 6 where she was adjusting the IV drip on the man who'd gone into shock earlier, and crossed to her with a velocity that was not quite an approach and not quite a confrontation, but occupied the space between them. "Ms. Tollens," he said, "I need a word." "One moment," she said. She finished adjusting the drip, made a note on the chart, said something quiet to the patient, who was better, pulse stabilized, color back, and then turned. Voss was standing with his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was trying to control how he was standing. His eyes were moving over her, the sutures, the dried blood at her hairline that hadn't fully cleaned off, the fatigue that she knew was visible if you looked for it. "My office," he said. "I've got patients. Bet it can cover for 10 minutes. It was not a question. Mara set the chart down and followed him. His office was off the administrative corridor, a small room with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked at the parking structure. He closed the door and turned around and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. There were too many things competing in it. "Tell me what happened tonight," he said. "It'll be in the incident report. Tell me yourself." She told him, same order, same facts, same neutral delivery she'd given DeLuca. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You disarmed a man with a shotgun," he said. "Yes." "Using a pair of medical shears and—" He looked at his notes. He'd apparently already read part of the preliminary report. "A coil of tubing." "The shears, yes. The tubing wasn't used." "Why did you take the tubing?" "I wasn't certain I'd need it," Mara said. "I took it in case I did." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was holding 2 things that didn't reconcile and was not yet willing to decide which one to put down. "You should have waited for law enforcement," he said. Mara was quiet. "You're a nurse," he said. "Your job is patient care, the appropriate response to an armed—" "One of them had a gun on a 22-year-old intern," Mara said. Her voice was level. "He was in nursing school. He'd never been in a room with a firearm before. The law enforcement response time from the county substation is between 11 and 15 minutes. I had already assessed the situation, assessed the individuals involved, and determined that the risk of waiting was higher than the risk of acting." She paused. "I made a judgment call. You can disagree with it, but the people in that room went home." Voss looked at her for a long time. "Who are you?" he said. And it wasn't rhetorical, not the way he usually spoke. The rhetorical questions that were actually statements dressed up as inquiry. It was a genuine question, maybe the first genuine question he'd ever asked her. Before she could answer, before she'd decided how much to answer, his office phone rang. He looked at it, picked it up, said his name, then listened, and something in his posture shifted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "When?" he said. A pause. "How many?" Another pause. His hand, she noticed, had tightened on the receiver. "I understand," he said. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." He hung up. He looked at Mara. "There are 2 federal investigators in the lobby," he said, "from the DEA. They say they've been working a case involving the individuals who came in tonight." He was still doing the thing with his expression. Too many competing elements, no resolution. "They're asking for you specifically." Mara was still. "Why?" she said, which was the right question to ask, even though some part of her already suspected the answer was going to rewrite something. "They wouldn't say," Voss said, "just that they need to speak with Mara Tollens and that it's relevant to an active federal investigation." He was looking at her differently now, not with the familiar flatness that he'd used for 14 months, not the contained dismissal that had become so routine she'd stopped noticing it. This was something else. This was a man standing at the edge of a context he hadn't built. Mara set her hands flat on the edge of his desk, pushed herself upright, and straightened her scrubs. "I'll go talk to them," she said. She walked to the door, had her hand on the handle. "Mara," Voss said. She waited. "The intern," he said. "Spence. He stopped, seemed to be deciding something. He came to find me when I arrived, before I found you. He said he wanted me to know that you were the reason nobody died tonight." Mara didn't turn around. "He's a good kid," she said. "He's going to be a good nurse." She opened the door and walked out. The administrative corridor was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrived after noise had used up all the available space and hadn't quite been replaced yet. The overhead lights were doing their job without fanfare. Somewhere in the building, a monitor was beeping in a steady mechanical rhythm that meant a patient's heart was doing what it was supposed to be doing. She walked toward the lobby at the pace of someone who had been walking toward hard things their whole life and had learned a long time ago that the pace didn't actually change what was waiting. Through the glass doors of the lobby, she could see 2 figures standing near the entrance, a man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both carrying the particular stillness of people who were used to waiting in places and not being noticed. The woman had a case file folder in her hand. The man had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at the floor. And then, as if he felt her approach, he looked up. He was older than she expected, mid-50s. He had the kind of face that had been somewhere specific and hadn't fully come back. She recognized that too, the geographic impression that certain kinds of service left on a person. When he saw her through the glass, his expression did something she wasn't expecting. It wasn't professional neutrality. It wasn't the face of a federal investigator arriving at a crime scene. It was the face of someone who recognized her. Mara pushed through the door. The man's name was Rourke. He said it the way people said names they'd stopped explaining. Just the last name, flat, as a fact rather than an introduction. He was DEA, he said, senior investigator, and the woman with him was his partner, Agent Solis. And they had been working a case for 11 months that had just intersected with Mara's night in a way that required a conversation. They took a room off the lobby, not an office, a consultation alcove with 2 chairs and a small table that was probably meant for families getting difficult news. Solis sat. Rourke stood near the door, which was a choice that told Mara something about how he operated. She sat, The 3 men who came in tonight, Rourke said. You know them? I know what they look like, Mara said. I knew them for about 40 minutes. The one you called Tanner, his full name is Drew Tanner. The one with the knife, Marcus Hale. The one with the shotgun is Kevin Price. He said the names in a register that meant he'd said them a lot. They're the operational end of a distribution network that's been moving fentanyl analogs through rural Montana for about 2 years. We've been building the case. We had Tanner under intermittent surveillance for 3 weeks. Then you know why they were here. They were here because their supply chain got disrupted last week. A seizure in Billings took out one of their upstream sources. They needed pharmaceutical-grade opioids fast, and Cascade Valley's overnight security profile made it a viable target. Solis said this with the flatness of someone reading from a document, which was how she talked. Economical, nothing wasted. What we didn't know was that they were going to move tonight. Mara looked at Rourke. You said they were under surveillance. Intermittent, he said. We had a gap. He said it without apology, which she respected more than if he'd offered one. A gap was a gap. Stating it plainly was the only honest response. Why do you need me? Because you put all 3 of them in custody tonight, and the way you did it is going to matter when this goes to trial. Rourke crossed his arms. Defense is going to argue entrapment, improper detainment, civil rights violations during the takedown. We need a clear, first-hand account of the threat level and your response to it that holds up against that challenge. He paused. And we need to know if they said anything to you, specifically about supply sources, contacts, distribution points, that would be relevant to the broader case. Mara thought back through the 40 minutes. Tanner's radio call. The voice on the other end saying his name. The shotgun man's operational calm. Price, she said. When he first came in, he told one of the others, Hale, that if the pharmacist wasn't there, they'd go to the secondary. He said it like they'd planned for it, like there was another location. Rourke and Solis looked at each other. You remember the exact phrasing, Solis said. Yes. Why? I was listening, Mara said. Another look between them. Rourke uncrossed his arms and sat in the empty chair. The dynamic shifted. Less interrogation, more conversation, which meant something had been decided. Ms. Tollens, he said, before tonight, what did you know about this network? Nothing. You had no prior contact with any of these individuals? No? And your background? He stopped. Started again. Your military record? 68 whiskey, 2 deployments. You left the Army 3 years ago, she said, with a full honorable discharge. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted register in a way she recognized, from investigative to something more direct, less mediated by procedure. I knew a Tollens, he said. Sergeant First Class. Michael Tollens, 2nd Deployment, Kandahar Province. The name landed in her chest with a weight that she didn't let show. My brother, she said. Rourke nodded slowly, like a confirmation he'd already half expected. He talked about you. Said his sister was the best combat medic in the theater and that she was being wasted in her current assignment. A pause. He meant it as a compliment. I know how he meant it, Mara said. He doing okay? He's fine, she said. He's in Missoula. He has 2 kids. Something in Rourke's face eased slightly. Not warmth. He wasn't that kind of person, but a genuine relief, the kind you felt about people you'd shared something difficult with and then lost track of. Good, he said. And then, I'm going to need you to come to our field office tomorrow afternoon. Full recorded statement, reviewed by our legal team. It'll take 2 or 3 hours. I'm on shift tomorrow night. I know, this would be before. He stood. We'll get you out in time. Solis was already closing her file. She paused at the door and looked back at Mara. For what it's worth, she said, the 3 men you detained tonight, Tanner especially, gave us a timeline problem for weeks. We couldn't get anyone close enough. She said it without inflection, the way you stated facts that happened to be adjacent to a compliment without making the compliment explicit. They left. Mara sat in the alcove alone for a moment. The fluorescent light above her had a slight flicker. Not bad enough to report, just enough to register. She looked at the table and thought about her brother, who was in Missoula with 2 kids, who had never once suggested she was anything other than exactly what she was. She thought about Rourke's face when she'd said Michael was fine. Then she stood up and went back to work, because there was still an hour and a half left on her shift. The morning arrived the way mornings arrived in November in Drover Falls. Gray first, then a pale wash of light that suggested sun without committing to it. The mountains to the east holding shadow until the last possible moment. By 7:15, the day shift was coming in and the night shift was filtering out, and the ER had been cleaned and reconfigured enough that it resembled itself again, though the ceiling tile with the shotgun hole had been taped over with blue painter's tape and would be stared at by everyone who walked under it for the next several days. Mara gave her hand off to the incoming nurse, a competent woman named Julia Morse who asked no questions about the tape on Mara's forehead and about 12 questions about the patient board, and then changed out of her scrubs in the locker room and sat on the bench for longer than she meant to. Her phone had 4 messages, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, probably. Someone had already talked. One from her brother, who had apparently heard something on the radio at 6 in the morning and sent a message that said, "Heard something on KGHL about Cascade Valley. You okay? Call me." The 4th was from a number she recognized and hadn't expected, Colonel Ray Dressler. She looked at his name on her screen for a moment. Dressler had been her commanding officer for most of her second deployment. She hadn't spoken to him in 14 months, not since she'd signed the discharge paperwork and he'd shaken her hand in a hallway and told her she was going to be fine, in a tone that meant he wasn't sure but hoped. His message was text, not a voicemail. 6 words. Call me when you can. Important. She didn't call him, not yet. She texted Michael back, "I'm fine, we'll call later," and put her phone in her bag and walked out to the parking lot. The air was 28 degrees and smelled like cold earth and diesel from the trucks on the highway. She stood next to her car for a moment and breathed it and let the accumulated weight of the past 7 hours settle into something she could carry without it buckling her. She drove home. She slept for 4 hours. She woke up and ate something and called her brother and talked to him for 22 minutes. He was angry in the way that people were angry when they were frightened and the danger was already over, and she let him be angry and said the right things, which were mostly variations of, "I know, and it's done now." And then she called Colonel Dressler. He picked up on the second ring. "Tollens," he said. "Colonel." "Sit down," he said. "I'm already sitting." "Good." A pause. She could hear him deciding how to start, which was unusual. Dressler was not a man who usually needed a running start. "I've been on the phone since 5 this morning, with the DEA field office in Helena, with the Sheriff's Department in Garfield County, with someone in Washington whose name I'm not going to say, on an unencrypted line." Another pause. "And with Cascade Valley's board of directors." Mara was quiet. "There's a situation developing," Dressler said. "Rourke's investigation, the network those men were part of, is bigger than a county distribution ring. It crosses state lines and it has a political dimension that I'm not going to go into over the phone. What I'll tell you is that your name is now attached to the public-facing side of it, and that has created some complications." "What kind of complications?" "The kind where certain people would prefer the story was told differently," he said. "Specifically, there's a question about whether your military training should have been disclosed to the hospital when you were hired, and whether not disclosing it constitutes a material misrepresentation." Mara felt something cold and precise move through her. "That's not a real legal theory," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it doesn't need to be a real legal theory to be used as a lever. Someone is trying to reframe last night from nurse stops armed robbery to undisclosed paramilitary operative acts outside her scope of practice in a clinical setting." "Who?" "I don't know yet." He said it in a way that meant he had a guess he wasn't ready to state. "What I know is that the hospital's legal department is meeting this morning and your employment status is on the table." Mara looked at the wall of her apartment. There was a crack in the plaster near the window frame that she'd been meaning to patch for 6 months. "They're going to try to fire me," she said. "They're going to try to make it look like your fault first," Dressler said. "Then fire you, yes." "Which will give the network's defense attorneys a narrative to work with. that the takedown was conducted by an unqualified actor operating outside sanctioned protocols, which muddies the evidentiary chain. That's... She stopped. The logic of it assembled itself fully, and she saw it whole. Not just a hospital protecting itself from liability, but something that used the hospital's self-protection as a mechanism for something larger. Someone's helping them. "That's my read," Dressler said. "I can't prove it yet." Rourke is aware. He's moving carefully because he doesn't know how far it goes. A pause. "Mara, I need you to not do anything precipitous today. Don't go to the hospital unless they call you in officially. Don't talk to media. If their legal team contacts you, say nothing until you have your own representation. I don't have a lawyer. You will. I'm making a call when we're done here." Another pause, and this one was different, longer, weighted differently. "I should have stayed in better contact. These past 3 years, I knew you were out there doing this, and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that you were fine." "I was fine," she said. "You were managing," he said. "That's different." She didn't answer. "The people who are trying to do this to you," he said, "they're counting on the same thing everyone else has been counting on, that you're alone, that you're quiet, that you don't have anyone making noise on your behalf." His voice shifted, still controlled, but the control was covering something with an edge to it. They miscalculated. Mara pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. Her sutures were tight from the cold, and her ear was still registering things at 90%. "How many people are you talking to?" she said. "Enough," he said. "Give me until this afternoon." She sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said. She hung up and looked at the crack in the plaster and thought about the precision required to make a problem look like someone else's fault, and the specific kind of person who was good at it, and the fact that she had, as of 6:30 this morning, apparently become a problem worth that kind of precision. She called Rourke. He picked up on the first ring. "I was going to call you," he said. "Tell me about the board of directors," she said. A short silence. "How do you know about that? Does it matter?" "Fair." She heard him move, standing up maybe, or walking to a window. "There's a member of Cascade Valley's board named Warren Gall. He's been on the board for 6 years. He also has a financial relationship with a pharmaceutical logistics company in Billings that we have been looking at in connection with the distribution network. He let that sit. It's possible that last night's incident complicated something he was managing, and he is now managing the complication." Mara processed this with the same precision she used to process incoming information in the field, not reactive, just cataloging, identifying vectors, locating the center of mass. "What do you need from me?" she said. "What I told you last night, your statement this afternoon, and..." Another pause. "If Gall moves against you at the hospital before we've built the evidentiary case, I need you to not fight it in a way that tips him off that we're looking at him." "You want me to let them fire me?" "I want you to not do anything that makes him think we're connected," Rourke said. "If he thinks last night was contained, an incident that's been neutralized, a witness who's been discredited, he makes another move. And when he makes another move, we'll have him." The silence that followed was not comfortable. "I know what I'm asking," Rourke said. "Do you?" Mara said. "I know it's your job," he said. "I know you've been building something here for 14 months. I know it's not nothing." His voice was steady and direct and didn't carry the false gentleness that people put into difficult requests when they didn't fully respect the person they were making them to. He wasn't asking her to be a martyr. He was asking her to be a resource. That was a different thing. "I'm asking you to trust a process that isn't finished yet." She looked at the crack in the plaster. Outside her window, 2 crows were arguing over something in the parking lot. The sound of them carried in the cold air, sharp, insistent, entirely indifferent to anything happening in the building behind them. "All right," she said. "Thank you," he said. And then, "Come in at 2, bring ID." She said she would. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and thought about 14 months of night shifts and chart reviews, and Voss's arms crossed over his chest, and Bet's apology in the dark of the early morning, and Garrett Spence's face when she'd told him to stay still, and he had. She thought about what it cost to be patient, and whether the cost was a fixed price or whether it accrued interest.
Then she showered and changed and drove to the DEA field office, and she gave them 3 hours of her afternoon, precise and complete. And she watched Solis type faster when she described the secondary location reference. And she watched Rourke's face when she repeated verbatim the radio exchange, the voice saying Tanner's name, the register of it, the fact that it had sounded like someone who expected a report and wasn't getting one. When it was done, Rourke walked her to the door. "There's something else," he said. He said it in the tone of a person who had been deciding whether to say it for the past 3 hours. The secondary location Price referenced. We had a candidate site already in the database, a veterinary supply facility in Wheatland County, about 60 miles north. He paused. "We sent a team this morning. They found it abandoned, recent, within 12 hours. He looked at her. "Someone moved the product before we could get there." Mara went still. "Which means," she said. "Which means someone knew we were moving," he said. "Someone with access to our operational timeline." He let that sit. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had just confirmed a suspicion that he wished he hadn't needed to confirm. An inside leak. Not just gall operating from the hospital board. Something closer. Outside, the wind off the mountains had picked up in the late afternoon, carrying the smell of incoming snow. The field office sat between a strip mall and a grain elevator, unremarkable from the outside, exactly what it was supposed to look like. Her phone buzzed. She looked down. A text from Betty Okafor. "HR called me in for questioning. They're asking about your hire documentation. Mara, there's someone from the board here. He's not from legal." She read it twice. When she looked up, Rourke was already watching her face. "They moved faster than you expected," she said. "Yes," he said. And for the first time since she'd met him 8 hours ago, Warren Rourke looked like a man who was not entirely in control of what happened next. Rourke didn't waste time standing in the doorway looking concerned. He stepped back inside, pulled out his phone, and made a call before Mara had finished reading Bet's text a second time. She listened to his half of it, terse, directional, the kind of conversation where the person on the other end had been waiting for it. He gave 2 names, Gall and Cascade Valley HR. He said, "Expedite the warrant application, and I need eyes on the building in the next 30 minutes. And then he hung up and looked at her. "Can you get Bet out of that meeting without tipping Gall that she's been in contact with you?" he said. Mara thought for a moment. "Bet's been at that hospital for 20 years. She knows every procedural exit available. Call her. Tell her to request union representation before answering any further questions. That buys her time, and it's completely within her rights, so it won't read as avoidance." Mara was already dialing. Bet picked up on the 3rd ring and said nothing, which meant she was still in the room with people she didn't trust. "It's me," Mara said. "Request union rep right now. Don't answer anything until your rep is present. That's not a suggestion." A brief pause. Then Bet said, in a completely different tone, professional, slightly formal, directed at someone else in the room, "I'm sorry, I'm going to need to pause this until my union representative is present. That's standard protocol for any HR inquiry that involves documentation review." A male voice, in the background, said something Mara couldn't make out. Betty said, "I understand. I'll wait outside." The call ended. Rourke was watching her. "Good," he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement of efficiency, which was how he communicated approval, and Mara had already calibrated to that. "What's the warrant for?" she said. "Gall's communications. Financial records tied to the logistics company." He slid his phone into his jacket. "We've had the probable cause for 72 hours. We were holding off to avoid alerting him before we had the full network mapped. But if he's already moving against witnesses, we don't have the luxury of patience anymore." "The leak," Mara said. "If someone inside your operation told him we were talking, then he knows we're looking at him." Rourke's jaw tightened, which means this afternoon was him trying to cut his exposure before we closed. Fire you, discredit your account, muddy the evidentiary chain on last night's arrests. He looked at her steadily. "It also means he's scared. Scared people make mistakes. Or they make things worse before they run," Mara said. "Also true." He held the door. "Come back inside. I need you for another hour." The hour turned into 2.
Solis pulled Gall's publicly available board records and cross-referenced them with the logistics company's incorporation filings, and Mara sat across from a junior investigator named Torres, who walked her through a series of photographs, faces, vehicles, locations, asking her to flag anything she recognized from the night before or from her 14 months at Cascade Valley. She flagged 3 things: a vehicle she'd seen in the hospital parking structure twice in the past month, a face she didn't know but had seen in the lobby once talking to someone from administration, and a name on a shipping manifest that Torres showed her as a blind item, a name she'd seen on a requisition form at the hospital that had come across the nursing station for a signature redirect. Torres wrote it all down without reacting. That was either meaningless or significant, and she couldn't tell which. At 5:40, Rourke came back into the room where she was waiting and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of her. It was from the machine down the hall, and it was bad, which she could tell from the color, but she drank it anyway because she'd been awake since before midnight, and the granola bar from the vending machine at 3 a.m. was doing nothing for anyone anymore. "The warrant came through," he said. "We're executing it tonight." Mara looked at him. "Gall's office at the hospital and his residence," Rourke said. "Also the Billings logistics facility." He sat down. "Here's what we know so far. Gall joined Cascade Valley's board 6 years ago. 2 years in, he facilitated a contract renewal with a medical supply distributor, legitimate company on paper, that had a secondary arrangement routing controlled substance overstock through an unofficial channel. It wasn't theft exactly. It was misclassification. Product documented as destroyed that wasn't destroyed. Small quantities at first." He paused. "Over 2 years, not small anymore." "How much did he know about the distribution end?" Mara said. "We think he knew exactly who was buying it and preferred not to know why," Rourke said, "which is its own kind of knowing." He wrapped his hands around his own coffee cup. Price, Hale, and Tanner were the retail operation. Gall was the supply pipeline. He didn't know them personally. There were 2 intermediaries. But last night's arrest put all 3 of them in custody before they could be moved, and any competent lawyer is going to start working backward from the pharmacy target to the supply chain. He looked at her. "You were in his building when you stopped them. You're a credible witness with a military record that makes your account hard to dismiss. From Gall's perspective, you're the thread that unravels the whole thing if you stay credible." Mara set the coffee down. "So the play was to pull the thread first. Discredit you before the investigation could formalize your role," Rourke said. "He moved faster than I expected because I underestimated how exposed he felt." A pause. "That's on me." She looked at him. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was stating a fact about his own error, which was a different thing, and she respected it in the same way she'd respected his earlier acknowledgement about the surveillance gap, not as a weakness, but as an accurate accounting. "What happens tonight?" she said. "We execute the warrants. If his communications show what we think they show, contact with network intermediaries, prior knowledge of the pharmacy plan, any coordination with someone inside this office, we move to arrest." He paused on the last part of that sentence in a way that acknowledged its weight. Someone inside his office. He hadn't looked away when he said it, which meant he was still deciding who, and the deciding was costing him something. "And the hospital," Mara said. "The board can't touch your employment while you're an active federal witness in an ongoing investigation. The moment we formalize your status, which happened about 2 hours ago when Torres took your supplemental statement, any adverse employment action against you becomes obstruction." He looked at her directly. "Gall either doesn't know that yet, or he moved before he thought it through. Either way, the meeting with HR is suspended pending legal review," Rourke said. "I called their general counsel 40 minutes ago." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite satisfaction, but the functional equivalent of a piece moving into position correctly. "Beta Okafor is no longer in that building." Mara exhaled slowly, not dramatically, just the particular release of a breath held against a contingency that no longer required holding. "Go home," Rourke said. "Sleep if you can. Don't come in tomorrow unless I call you." She stood. Her body registered the full weight of 30-plus hours without proper rest in the way that bodies did. Not a collapse, just an accounting. She was fine. She'd been more tired in worse situations with higher stakes and no coffee at all, even bad coffee. "Rourke," she said at the door. He looked up. "The person inside your office," she said. "When you find them, and you will, don't let it make you smaller about who you trust next time." He held her gaze for a moment. "Is that advice from your own experience?" "It's advice from watching what happens to people who don't take it," she said. She drove home in the dark and slept for 7 hours without dreaming. She woke at 2 in the morning to her phone. Not Rourke, not Dressler. The number was the hospital's main line, which was unusual enough that she answered it. The voice was Dr. Lena Park, and it was controlled in a way that meant something was actively wrong. "I need you to come in," Park said. "I know what Rourke told you. This is different. It's not administrative." A pause. "Kevin Price was transferred from County Holding to our facility 2 hours ago for a cardiac event. He's in Bay 3. Mara, he's asking for you." The silence that followed had a specific texture. "Why?" Mara said. "He won't say. He'll talk to the guard, he'll talk to the attending. That's Morrow. He came in for the transfer. But anytime anyone tries to get a statement or a clinical history, he says he'll only give it to the nurse from last night." Park's voice was flat, but underneath it was something taut. "His attending thinks it's a manipulation play. The guard thinks the same. I don't know what it is, but I thought you should be the one to decide whether to come." Mara was already sitting up. "Is he actually symptomatic?" "Chest pain, elevated troponin on the initial draw, EKG changes consistent with NSTEMI. It's real," Park said. "Whether the request for you is connected to the real medical situation or running alongside it, that I can't tell you." Mara thought. Price was the steady one, the one who didn't panic. If he was asking for her specifically, it wasn't because he was frightened of a strange nurse. He'd had no particular reaction to her last night beyond treating her as a manageable obstacle right up until she stopped being one. This was deliberate. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She called Rourke from the car. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Don't go in without a recorder," he said. "Anything he says to you in a clinical capacity is different from a custodial interrogation, but if he volunteers information, you don't solicit." "I know the distinction," she said. "Do you have a recorder?" "My phone." "Keep it in your pocket, running, from the moment you walk in." He paused. "And Mara, he's still a man who put a gun to a 22-year-old's collarbone last night. Don't let the hospital setting recalibrate that." "It won't," she said. She walked into Cascade Valley at 2:41 in the morning. The overnight staff looked at her with a particular mix of expressions. The people who'd been there last night with recognition and something else. Something that hadn't fully named itself yet. The day shift holdovers who'd heard about it had the look of people adjusting their understanding of someone they thought they already knew. She nodded to the ones who caught her eye and kept moving. Bay 3 was screened off. A county deputy was stationed outside, young, trying to project authority, succeeding in a basic way. He checked her badge and her credentials and called someone on his radio and then stepped aside. Kevin Price was lying in the bed at a 30-degree incline, monitor leads on his chest, an IV running saline at a maintenance rate. The EKG trace on the monitor above him was doing what Park had described. ST changes in the inferior leads, not dramatic, but there. The kind that meant the heart was protesting something. His color was off. Not critically, but enough. Whatever was happening in his chest was real. He looked at her when she came in. She pulled on gloves. She checked his IV site, checked the monitor, pulled the initial lab results from the chart reader on the wall, and looked at them. Troponin at 0.4. Not a massive elevation, but elevated. First draw, so the trend wasn't established yet. She noted the time of the draw, calculated the window for the repeat. "You actually read it," Price said. His voice was lower than it had been last night, rougher, the way voices got when the body was diverting resources away from non-essential functions. "It's your chart," she said. The other nurse didn't read it. She looked at the screen for about 2 seconds and left. "People do their jobs differently," Mara said. She set the chart reader down and looked at him. "Why did you ask for me?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ceiling with the particular focus of someone who was going to say something that cost them something and was taking a run-up at it. "Gall," he said. Mara kept her face neutral. She moved to check his peripheral pulse. Radial, right wrist, clinical reason to be close and to stay present while he talked. His pulse was 68, slightly irregular. "Warren Gall," Price said. "He called Hale's phone at 11:15 last night, before we went in. He told us the hospital was clear, that the overnight security protocols had been modified and the response time window was extended." He paused. "He was wrong, obviously, but the call happened." "Hale's phone is in evidence," Mara said. "I know," Price said. "That's why I'm telling you." He turned his head to look at her. His eyes were the same as last night, controlled, calculating. But there was something underneath the calculation now that hadn't been there before. Not remorse exactly. More like the specific pragmatism of someone who had looked at their available options and found one they could live with. "There's a voicemail." He left a voicemail because Hale didn't pick up. Gall's voice, his name, the hospital, the time, specific protocol details that only a board member would have. He stopped. He thought the phone would be gone. He didn't know Hale keeps everything. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Gall is trying to put everything on us," Price said. "We were the operation. We take the charges. Fine. That's the business. But he was the one who cleared the path, and he's in there right now." He gestured, a small movement constrained by the IV line, vaguely toward the administrative side of the building. "Trying to make sure we carry it alone while he walks." His jaw tightened. "I don't do that." It was not a moral statement. It was a professional one, which Mara understood. The ethics of it were their own thing, separate from what was useful right now. "Hale's phone," she said. "Where is it?" "Not in evidence," Price said. "Hale has 2 phones. The one they took last night was the operational one. The other one—" He stopped. "Where?" she said. "His girlfriend's apartment. Drover Falls. Her name is Anita Morrow." He caught Mara's expression at the surname and said, "Not the doctor. Different family." He coughed once, controlled, and the monitor blipped. "She doesn't know what's on it. She's been sitting on it because she doesn't know what to do." Mara straightened. She moved to the monitor and looked at the trace without seeing it, because she was running through what she'd just heard and checking it against what she knew. If Price was telling the truth, and the specificity of it had the texture of truth, the kind of detail that was hard to fabricate under cardiac stress at 3 a.m, then there was a voicemail from Warren Gall on a phone in a private residence in Drover Falls that documented his direct operational role in last night's robbery. And Gall's warrant was being executed tonight. If his lawyers moved fast enough to establish a narrative before that phone surfaced. She took her phone out of her pocket. She was already calling Rourke before she'd consciously decided to. He picked up immediately. She said, "I need 30 seconds and I need you to listen." And she gave it to him cleanly. The name, the phone, the girlfriend's address, the voicemail. Rourke said, "Don't move." And then she heard him on another line, his voice dropping into operational register, clipped and fast. And she held her phone and stood in Bay 3 with Kevin Price's monitor tracing its irregular rhythm above her, and she waited. Price looked at her. "He's going to get the phone," she said. "I figured," Price said. "You want something in exchange," she said. "For this." He was quiet for a moment. "I want it on record that I cooperated voluntarily, that I provided information without coercion, without a deal in place, without legal representation present." That's an unusual thing to want. "I know what I did last night," he said. "I know what I'm facing. I'm not asking to walk." He looked at the ceiling again. "I'm asking for it to count." Mara looked at him for a long moment. He was not a good man in any simple sense of that word. He had walked into her hospital with a weapon and discharged it in a room full of sick people, and he had done it with the competent calm of someone who had calculated the risk and decided it was acceptable. She knew that. She didn't file it under anything else. But she also knew that the call to Rourke was already made, and that what happened next was not hers to control, and that sometimes the instrument of accountability came from directions you hadn't sanctioned. "I'm a nurse," she said. I can't promise you anything about what the DEA or the DA does with your cooperation. I know that, he said. I can document that this conversation was voluntary and initiated by you. She paused. That's what I can do. He nodded. Once. The way someone nodded when they'd accepted the terms of a thing they'd already decided on. She pulled the chart reader back down and began documenting. Clinical notes first, because his troponin needed a repeat draw in 2 hours and his IV rate needed reassessment. And regardless of everything else, Kevin Price was a patient in her care, and that required certain things. And then she opened the nursing narrative section and began writing, precisely and completely, the account of what he'd told her and in what context and with what apparent affect. And she wrote it the way she wrote everything, without decoration, without interpretation, just what happened and in what order. Roark called back at 3:14. "We have the phone," he said. "The voicemail is there. Gall's voice, his name, the details Price described." A pause. Short, controlled, but she could hear something in it. "It's enough." "Are you moving on him tonight?" "We're already moving," Roark said. "He's at his residence. The warrant team is 6 minutes out." Another pause. "The leak. The person inside my office." It was a paralegal who had access to the warrant application timeline. She'd been feeding case updates to an intermediary for 8 months. His voice was flat and precise, and underneath the flatness was something that had the specific weight of betrayal that had been confirmed rather than suspected. "She's been detained." Mara stood outside Bay 3 in the corridor, her back against the wall, the hospital running its quiet nighttime operations around her. Monitors, footsteps, the distant sound of a supply cart rolling down a linoleum floor. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yeah," Roark said. It was one word and it carried everything it needed to. She went back inside and checked Price's IV and ordered the repeat troponin draw and updated his care plan, and she did all of it with the same attention she brought to every patient because that was what the work required, and the work was the work regardless of who it was for. At 4:07 in the morning, Mara was in the medication room doing a routine count when Betty Okafor appeared in the doorway. Bet had not been scheduled tonight. She was in street clothes, jeans, and a heavy pullover, and she looked like someone who had not slept and had come in anyway because staying away felt worse. "I heard Price was here," Bet said. "He is." "I heard you came in." "I did." Bet stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Is it done?" she said. "The gall thing. Is it done?" "Close," Mara said. Bet nodded slowly. She looked like she was processing something that had been sitting with her since the morning, working through it in the way that a person worked through a thing that changed the shape of what they thought they understood. "There's going to be a board meeting tomorrow," Bet said. "Emergency session. The general counsel called it when the DEA contacted the hospital." She paused. "They're going to need to address Gall's seat and the HR inquiry against you. Both." "I know." "Voss," Bet said. "He's been on the phone with legal all evening." She stopped. "I think he's trying to figure out which direction is forward." Mara finished her medication count and signed the log and put it back in its slot. "People do that," she said. "Some of them get it right," Bet said. "Some of them," Mara agreed. She went back to her patient. At 5:52 in the morning, as the first gray was beginning to suggest itself against the eastern face of the mountains, Roark texted her 2 words. "He's arrested." She read it standing at the nursing station with a cup of the same bad coffee that Cascade Valley produced at every hour of the day without variation, and she read it again. And then she set her phone face down on the counter and looked at the patient board. 8 names. 8 people in this building who needed various things in the next 2 hours before the day shift arrived. She started with the one in Bay 3 because his troponin repeat had come back and it needed to be reviewed, and because regardless of how the night had ended or what the morning was going to bring, Kevin Price had an injured heart that required specific attention, and specific attention was what she gave. The results were on the monitor when she walked in. She looked at them. The second troponin was higher than the first, 0.7, up from 0.4, which confirmed the trend and meant cardiology needed to be paged, and the protocol for non-ST elevation MI needed to be initiated and the attending needed to be notified. She was already pulling up the paging system when Price's monitor changed, not dramatically, Not a flatline, not a crash. A shift. The rhythm on the screen went from irregular but functional to something else. Something with a particular signature she recognized in the way you recognize things you'd seen under pressure in bad places, with inadequate equipment, and understood in your body before your brain had finished articulating it. Ventricular tachycardia. Fast, wide complexes. His pressure on the continuous monitor dropped 12 points in the time it took her to cross the room. "I need a crash cart in Bay 3, she said into the room's intercom, her voice carrying exactly as much urgency as the situation required, and no more. VTAC, spontaneous onset, hemodynamically unstable. Get me Dr. Morrow." And then she was at the bedside, her hands on the situation, doing what she did. Outside in the corridor, she could hear running feet. She could hear the cart coming. She could hear the hospital shifting into its emergency register. The particular change in atmospheric pressure that a building underwent when the work became something other than routine. Price looked up at her from the bed. His eyes were still controlled, still calculating, but underneath that was something that was not calculation at all. "You're fine," she said. It was not reassurance, it was a clinical direction. "Look at me. Breathe at my pace. In." He breathed. Out. He breathed. The cart arrived. Dr. Morrow came through the curtain. The work shifted into the collaborative register of an emergency team doing its job, and Mara moved through it with the same economy she brought to everything. Precise, fast, nothing wasted, nothing performed. What she didn't see, because she was doing her job and the work required all of her, was Dr. Hadley Voss standing in the corridor outside Bay 3. He had come in early. He was in his street clothes still, tie not quite done, coffee in hand, and he was watching through the gap in the curtain with an expression that no one on the night shift had seen from him before. Not the crossed arms, not the managed neutrality, not the administrative distance. He was watching a nurse work. And he was watching the way you watched something you had not allowed yourself to see clearly for 14 months, and whatever it cost him to see it now was visible on his face to anyone who happened to look. No one happened to look, because everyone was watching Mara. At 6:14, Kevin Price's rhythm converted back to sinus with the second dose of amiodarone, and the room's emergency register settled, and Mara stepped back from the bedside and stripped off her gloves and looked at the monitor trace with the particular attention of someone confirming a calculation. Stable, for now. She turned to update the chart and found Garrett Spence standing at the curtain. He was in his civilian clothes. He had apparently come in before his shift started, which was not required and not expected. He looked like someone who had processed the events of the previous night in the particular way that very young people processed the first time they understood what they were capable of. Not triumphant, not traumatized, but recalibrated. "I heard the page," he said. "I thought—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought." "You're not on until 7, she said. "I know." He looked at Price in the bed and then back at her. "Is he going to be okay?" "Probably," she said. "He needs cardiology. He needs a proper workup and probably a cath, but the immediate event is resolved." Garrett nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the corridor was normalizing, the crash cart being restocked, the overnight staff giving their handoffs, the first of the day shift lights coming on in the administrative wing. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. "I looked up the Army combat medic citation requirements last night," he said, "after everything, before I slept." He paused. "The decorations, what they're given for." He stopped, seemed to be deciding whether to finish the sentence. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know," he said. I wanted you to know that I looked it up." She looked at him for a moment. He was 22 years old, and he had kicked a gun under a cart in the middle of an armed robbery, and he had held his fear down with both hands and trusted someone he barely knew, and he was standing here now trying to find the words for something that he instinctively understood deserved words. "Get some breakfast before your shift," she said. "You're going to need it." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He went. She turned back to the chart and began writing the clinical narrative for the amiodarone administration and the rhythm conversion and the next steps in Price's care. And she wrote it precisely and completely the way she wrote everything. Behind her, in the corridor, she heard footsteps stop. She heard someone clear their throat. The particular sound of a person preparing to say something they had been preparing to say for longer than this morning. She didn't turn around. "Mara," said Dr. Hadley Voss. She kept writing. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Not about last night. About—" He stopped. Started again. "About the past 14 months. The monitor above Price's bed traced its steady rhythm. The hospital was waking up around them. Footsteps in the corridor, voices at the station, the first of the day shift nurses coming through the main entrance with coffee and coats. Mara finished her note. She saved it. She turned around. Voss looked like a man who had been standing outside a room for a long time and had finally walked in, and the walking in had cost him something, and he was still paying it. He opened his mouth to say whatever he had come to say. His personal cell phone rang. He looked at it. His face changed in a way that Mara could not immediately read. Not one thing, several things, moving across his expression in a sequence that ended somewhere she hadn't expected. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. The name on it was the hospital's board chairman, Gerald Fitch, and below the name, a text notification had pushed through. Emergency board session called 7 a.m. Gall arrested overnight federal charges. All department heads required. This involves Tollens. Come prepared. Voss looked at her. "I think," he said slowly, "that the conversation I need to have with you might need to happen before 7. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the mountains were catching the first real light of morning. Not the gray suggestion of it, but the actual thing, sharp and clear and coming over the ridge with the particular indifference of something that happened every day regardless of what anyone down below had been doing in the dark. Mara looked at Voss. "Start talking," she said. Voss talked for 11 minutes. He talked standing in the corridor outside Bay 3 with the morning light starting to come through the end window and Kevin Price's monitor beeping its steady recovered rhythm behind the curtain. And he didn't ask her to sit down or suggest they find a better location because there wasn't time for any of that, and on some level she thought he understood that doing it here, in the middle of the work, in the place where all of it had happened, was the only honest way to do it. He told her that he had known, within her first 2 months, that her clinical instincts were better than most of what he'd trained under his own supervision. He said it plainly, without performing contrition, which made it land differently than an apology would have. He told her that he had read her military record, not the full classified version, but the publicly accessible service summary, in month 3, after she'd made a call on a patient presentation that he'd been about to misread, and that the information had made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't examined honestly until last night. "Uncomfortable how?" she said. He took a breath. "Because it meant I'd been wrong about the ceiling," he said, "and I'd been enforcing it anyway." Mara looked at him. He was not a man who found self-examination natural. She could see the effort of it in the way he was standing. No crossed arms, no managed professional distance, just a man in a slightly undone tie with cold coffee in his hand, being exact about something that didn't make him look good. "Why tell me now?" she said. "Because Gall is arrested and there's a board meeting in an hour, and your name is going to be in the center of both," he said. "And because if I walk into that meeting without having said this to you first, I'm doing the same thing I've been doing for 14 months, deciding what's comfortable for me and calling it institutional management." He paused. "I was wrong about your competence, about the ceiling, about what I owed you professionally. That's what I needed to say." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the day shift arriving in increments. Voices, the specific rhythm of people starting their work, the small sounds of a hospital coming back to full operational life. "I heard you," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution, and she didn't dress it up as either. It was an acknowledgement that the words had been said and received and filed accurately, and that was what she had to give right now. And Voss seemed to understand that because he nodded once and didn't ask for more. "The board meeting," she said. 7 sharp, conference room on the administrative level. He looked at his phone. "Fitch is going to want a full account of the investigation, your role, the evidentiary value of your witness status, the liability question." He paused. "I'm going to be in that room. I want you to know that before you decide whether to be there." "I'll be there," she said. She had 40 minutes.
She used 20 of them on patient handoff. Clean, complete, nothing dropped. And the other 20 sitting in the break room with the bad coffee and her phone and a granola bar that she ate mechanically because her body needed fuel regardless of what her mind was doing. She called Dressler at 6:42. He picked up immediately, which meant he'd been awake for hours. "Board meeting at 7, she said. "I know," he said. "Rourke called me at 4. I've been on with the Army Public Affairs Office since 5. A pause. "Mara, there's something you need to know before you go into that room." She waited. "There's going to be a recommendation coming through official channels this week. The Army's, not the hospitals," he said. "I put it in motion last night after I got off the phone with you. It was something I should have initiated before you left the service, and I didn't. And that's a debt I've been carrying." He paused again, longer this time. "Your citation from the second deployment. The action in Zabul province. The board approved the upgrade 6 months ago, and it's been sitting in processing because nobody was pushing it forward." His voice was careful and direct, and underneath it was the thing he'd said 2 days ago about the difference between fine and managing. "It's been pushed. You'll have the formal notification within the week." Mara set the granola bar wrapper down on the table. She knew which action he meant. She didn't need him to describe it. She had been living with the memory of that day for 3 years. Not constantly, not in a way that broke her, but as a permanent background fact, the way a scar was a permanent background fact. 14 soldiers. A vehicle ambush on a supply route, 4 hours without resupply or aerial support. She had done what needed doing, and then she had gotten on a transport, and she had not talked about it. "Okay," she said. "That's all you've got?" he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor but lived near it. "I'll have more later," she said. "Right now I have a board meeting." He made a sound that was agreement and affection compressed into a single syllable, which was about as expressive as Dressler got, and they ended the call. She sat for 1 more minute. Just 1. She let the weight of the past 36 hours sit with her fully for 60 seconds, without filing it or managing it or converting it into something functional. The shotgun strike, the sutures, the cold air in the DEA parking lot, Price's rhythm converting back to sinus on the monitor, Garrett's face when he said I looked it up. She let all of it be what it was, enormous and costly, and hers. Then she stood up and went to the meeting. Of course, the conference room on the administrative level seated 12. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on the east side that currently framed the mountains in full morning light, gold and clean-edged, the kind of view that Drover Falls residents either stopped noticing or never stopped noticing, depending on the person. There were 9 people already seated when Mara walked in. She knew 4 of them. The other 5 were board members she'd seen in the building twice in 14 months. Gerald Fitch, the board chairman, was at the head of the table. He was in his 60s, compact, with a quality of stillness that suggested he was accustomed to being the person who set the temperature of a room. He looked at Mara when she entered, and his expression was carefully neutral, which was a statement in itself. Voss was at the far end. He had fixed his tie. He did not look up immediately when she came in, but when he did, something in his posture was different from every previous configuration she'd seen from him. Rourke was there, which she hadn't expected. He was in a chair against the wall, not at the table, which was its own signal, with a folder in his lap and his jacket on, which meant he'd come from somewhere and was going somewhere else. Betty Okafor was seated at the table, which was also unexpected. Betty looked like someone who had been asked to come and had decided on the way over exactly how much she was willing to say and had made peace with it. Mara sat in the empty chair across from Fitch. He opened the meeting without preamble, which she respected. He gave the essential facts in chronological order: the arrests, the investigation, Gall's position on the board, and the nature of his alleged involvement, the warrant execution, the federal charges filed at 5:14 that morning. He spoke with the careful neutrality of a man who was managing significant institutional risk and knew it and wasn't pretending otherwise. Then he looked at Mara. "Ms. Tollens," he said, "the board is grateful for your actions 2 nights ago. That is not in question." He paused. "What is in question is the appropriate response to an employment process that was improperly initiated, and the hospital's responsibility to you going forward." "The HR inquiry," she said, which was initiated at the direction of a board member who was, at that time, using his position to protect his personal legal exposure, Fitch said. He said it clearly and without softening, which told her that the board had already had a different conversation before this one. That inquiry is formally closed. It will be expunged from your record. Any documentation generated in connection with it will be destroyed. Mara was quiet. Additionally, Fitch said, the board has reviewed your personnel file this morning.
It has been brought to our attention that certain documentation in your file was improperly flagged by a department head, and that this flagging affected your performance review trajectory and your advancement consideration. He didn't look at Voss. Voss looked at the table. That documentation has been corrected. At the far end of the table, one of the board members Mara didn't know, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had been in institutional management for a long time and had seen enough to be precise about it, said, Ms. Tollens, I want to be direct with you. The board has been made aware of your military record and the nature of your service. The question before us this morning is not just how to remediate what was done wrong, but how to move forward in a way that reflects what you actually are to this institution. What am I to this institution? Mara said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, asked simply. The woman, her nameplate said Kwan, looked at her steadily. An asset that was mismanaged, she said, and an employee who protected 31 people in this building 2 nights ago, while a board member was actively working against the institution's integrity. She paused. Those 2 facts exist at the same time, and we're going to have to sit with both of them. Rourke spoke from his chair against the wall. He had been quiet until now, and when he spoke, the room's attention shifted toward him with the particular gravity of someone who had not been invited to be central, but was central anyway. I want to put something on the record for this board, he said. The evidentiary contribution that Ms. Tollens made to our investigation over the past 18 hours was substantial and voluntary. Her initial detainment of the 3 suspects preserved the evidentiary chain that is now at the foundation of a federal prosecution. Her identification of a secondary reference at the scene led us to a candidate site. Her statement provided specific detail about communication she'd witnessed that helped establish Gall's operational awareness. He paused. She did all of this while working a full overnight shift after taking a weapon strike to the head, and without any obligation to cooperate beyond a standard witness statement. Another pause. I've worked with a lot of people. I want this board to understand what they have. The room was quiet. Mara was looking at the table in front of her. The light from the east window was on the surface, moving slightly as the sun cleared the ridge. She wasn't performing humility, and she wasn't performing anything else. She was sitting with what was being said, feeling the weight of it, letting it be real rather than immediately converting it into something manageable. It was harder than anything else she'd done in the past 2 days. Fitch looked at her. Ms. Tollens, the board would like to discuss with you a revised role here at Cascade Valley. Formally, with compensation and title adjusted to reflect your actual qualifications and experience. He paused. That conversation will need to happen separately, and I want your input into what that looks like, not just a structure handed down to you. He stopped. Is that something you're willing to have? She looked at him. There was a version of this moment where she said yes immediately, where the recognition landed clean and complete and satisfying, where 14 months of accumulated cost was simply balanced against this morning's accounting, and the numbers worked out. She'd seen enough stories told that way to know how it was supposed to go. The reality was grainier than that. I'm willing, she said, but I want to say something first. Fitch nodded. She looked around the table, not performing, just deciding to say the true thing. I didn't come here with a hidden agenda, she said. I came here because I wanted to do clinical work, and I was good at it, and I needed to rebuild something quiet after 6 years of the opposite of quiet. She paused. I didn't disclose my full military background because it wasn't clinically relevant and because I'd watched what happened when people processed that information about me. They either turned it into a liability or they turned it into a novelty, and I didn't want to manage either of those things. She looked at Voss briefly. Not with heat, just acknowledgement. I was right that it would be mishandled. I was wrong to think the answer was to disappear around it. Voss, at the end of the table, did not look away. The work I do here matters to me, she continued, not because of what it proved about me or what it might prove, because the patients are real and the calls are real, and that night, the 31 people in this building were real. She stopped. If a new role means I can do more of that work with more authority and fewer obstacles, I want that conversation. If it means becoming an administrator or a symbol or a liability management strategy, I'll pass. Quan almost smiled. It was very controlled, but it was there. Noted, Fitch said. And he said it in a way that meant it was actually noted, not managed. Chati. The board meeting ended at 8:40. The formal restructuring conversation was scheduled for the following week. The HR expungement was processed before noon. At 2 in the afternoon, Rourke sent her a text. Gall arraigned this morning. Federal charges, 10 counts, no bail. His lawyers are already trying to negotiate, and the voicemail is making that very difficult for them. She read it and put her phone in her pocket and went back to her shift. It was not a triumphant afternoon. She was tired in that layered way that didn't resolve quickly, and her sutures pulled when she turned her head too fast. And the ringing in her left ear had reduced to something she could mostly ignore but hadn't fully gone away. She made a medication error almost. Caught it at the verification stage, corrected it, documented the near miss the way you were supposed to, felt the particular cold clarity of how close clean margins actually were sometimes. That was the thing nobody showed in the stories about competence. You were capable right up until the moment you weren't, and the difference between those moments was often sleep and food and whether the circumstances cooperated, none of which were under your full control. She had been sharp and effective when it counted. She had also nearly given the wrong dose to a post-operative patient at 2 in the afternoon on 30-odd hours of fractured rest. Both of those were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other out. She documented the near miss and moved on. At 5:15, she was in the corridor outside the supply room when she heard Garrett Spence's voice from around the corner. He was talking to one of the day shift nurses, not performing, just talking, and she heard him say, matter-of-factly, "She told me to stay still, and I did. And then everything she said was going to happen, happened." And the day shift nurse said something she couldn't hear, and Garrett said, "I know, that's the part I keep thinking about." She didn't round the corner. She kept going. Dressler called at 6. "The notification is in processing," he said. "Official paperwork in 4 to 7 days, but I wanted you to hear it directly from me before the letter." He paused. Staff Sergeant Mara Tollens, upgraded commendation for valor under fire, Zabul Province, 2nd deployment. The citation is going to include the full account. Another pause. 14 soldiers, Mara. 14. She was standing in the break room. The same chair, the same bad coffee, the same fluorescent light with its slight flicker. "I know how many," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it because it deserves to be said out loud. Not just in a document, not just in a file." His voice was not sentimental. Dressler didn't do sentiment, but it was exact in a way that was its own kind of weight. "You brought 14 people home in conditions that would have killed most of the people sitting in this office making decisions about your record." She held the phone and looked at the wall. Here was the thing about that day in Zabul that she had never said to anyone, that she had carried in the part of herself that didn't convert into manageable form. She hadn't known if she was going to be enough. She had known her training, and she had known the procedures, and she had worked with the absolute focus of someone who had nothing left except the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next. And it had been enough. And she had never once been certain it would be. The gap between those two facts, being enough and not knowing you would be, was where she actually lived, where most people who did this work actually lived. The certainty was something people added afterward, in the telling, because the gap was too uncomfortable to leave unfilled. The 14 people who had come home did not know about the gap. They knew about the outcome. She had never corrected the impression. "Thank you, Colonel," she said, for pushing it forward. "Should have done it 2 years ago," he said. "Some things take longer than they should." They ended the call. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that was the kind of cold that Drover Falls specialized in, specific, no nonsense, the temperature meaning it, there was a small formal event in the hospital's main conference room. Not a ceremony exactly, because Mara had requested specifically that it not be called that. A recognition, which was the word they'd settled on after some negotiation. The room held about 30 people. Board members, senior staff, the overnight crew from the night of the incident, those who could make it, those who wanted to. Sergeant DeLuca was there from the sheriff's department, which Mara hadn't expected. Agent Solis was there. Rourke was not, which she understood. The prosecution was in active motion, and his presence would have been complicated. Garrett Spence was there in a collared shirt that he had clearly ironed for the occasion, which was the most dressed up she'd ever seen him, and which was somehow the detail that made the room feel real. Bede Okafor was there. She was in the third row, arms folded, expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she was holding something in that she was going to let out later, privately, and she caught Mara's eye once and gave her a single nod that contained an entire conversation. Dressler had sent a letter, which was read by the board's vice chair. Not the citation, not the formal commendation language, but a separate personal letter that he'd apparently drafted and sent without telling Mara he was going to. She heard it read from the front of the room and kept her face still throughout, which took more effort than most things she'd done recently. Mara Tollens is one of the finest medics I have served alongside in 23 years of active duty, the letter said, in part. She is not exceptional because of what she did 2 weeks ago, though what she did 2 weeks ago was exceptional. She is exceptional because of the consistency of judgment that made that night possible. Judgment that she brings to a wound dressing the same as she brings to a crisis, because to her, they are both simply the work, and the work deserves everything she has. She is the kind of person who makes the people around her better without ever telling them that's what she's doing. Fitch spoke. Voss spoke, briefly, and what he said was not self-exculpatory, which was the minimum requirement, and he met it. Dr. Park, who had not been planning to speak, stood up at the end and said 3 sentences that were the most efficient and precise thing said in the room all afternoon. I knew something was different about her on her first shift. I didn't say it. I'm saying it now. Then they asked Mara to speak. She stood. She had thought about what to say. She'd rejected 3 versions of it before settling on the actual thing, which was shorter than any of the versions and less shaped, and was the only one that had the texture of what she actually thought. I spent a long time believing that being quiet about what I was capable of was the same as being humble about it, she said. It's not. Humility is knowing your limits. Being quiet about your capability is something else. It's a kind of preemptive defeat. You manage other people's discomfort with who you are by shrinking yourself until you fit their expectations, and you call it not making a fuss, and it costs more than you account for. The room was very still. I'm not saying that's what everyone who underestimates themselves is doing, she continued. Sometimes you genuinely don't know yet what you're capable of. But sometimes you know, and you hide it because you've been taught that the cost of being visible is too high. And in my experience, not just the last 2 weeks, but the work I did before this, the years in places I'm not going to describe here, the cost of being invisible is higher. She paused. Not always. Not for every person in every situation, but often enough that it's worth examining. She looked at Garrett in his ironed shirt. The intern who was with me that night, she said, made one decision in the middle of everything that mattered. He stayed still when I told him to, and he moved when there was something he could do. He didn't know if I was right. He chose to trust a person who hadn't told him why she could be trusted. I've been thinking about that. She paused. Trusting someone's competence before you have full evidence of it is its own kind of courage. He doesn't get enough credit for that. Garrett looked at the floor. His jaw was doing something that he was working to control. She turned back to the room. The recognition today is for specific actions on a specific night, she said. I accept it. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter because that would be a performance of modesty I don't actually feel. It matters. Being seen after a long time of not being seen, that matters. She stopped. But the thing I actually want to say is this. There are people in this room who do exceptional work every day in an institution that doesn't always see them clearly, and no crisis is going to make their work visible the way mine was made visible, and they deserve the same accounting. She looked at Bet. Some of them have been holding this place together for 20 years, while the recognition went somewhere else, and that's worth saying out loud. Bet's expression did something complicated and brief, and then returned to neutral. So,
Mara straightened. Thank you for the recognition. I'll try to continue deserving it.
And I'd like to get back to work now, if we're done, because there are patients upstairs who need things. There was a pause, and then the room did something that it hadn't been formally invited to do, which was to begin applauding with the specific quality of people who meant it, not performing a social function, but actually responding to a thing that had happened. She let it be what it was for 5 seconds. Then she moved toward the door, because she'd meant it about the patients. Garrett caught her in the corridor outside. He fell into step beside her, not stopping her, just walking with her, which was the right call. The thing you said about trust, he said. Yeah. I didn't know if you were right, he said. I want to be honest about that. I was terrified, and I made a decision and it worked out, but I didn't know. I know you didn't, she said. That's the whole point. He thought about that for a moment. Is it always going to feel like that? The not knowing? In my experience, she said, the people who stop feeling the not knowing are the ones you want to watch out for. She glanced at him. The gap between what you know you can do and the certainty that it'll be enough. You don't eliminate that gap. You just get faster at working inside it. He was quiet for a half flight of stairs. I'm applying for the trauma certification program, he said. In Billings, the one that starts in spring. Good, she said. I was going to wait another year, he said. I thought I wasn't ready. She looked at him. 22 years old, collared shirt, nursing school behind him, and everything else ahead, standing on the edge of his own capability with the specific mix of fear and clarity that meant he was actually ready and knew it and was still afraid, which was the correct state to be in. You're ready, she said. He nodded. Something in him settled. They reached the 3rd floor and separated toward their respective sections, and Mara walked her corridor the way she walked at every shift, checking the board, noting the census, calibrating to what the next hours required. At the end of the corridor, through the window, the mountains were exactly as they always were, enormous, indifferent, doing nothing but being there, which was enough. She had not solved the problems of this institution. Voss was going to have better days and worse days, and the work of changing a culture was not a single meeting and not a single night, and not a single act of visibility, however loud. There were still people in this building who were going to underestimate the next person who didn't fit their expectations. And the next, because that was how institutions worked, slowly, incompletely, resistant to revision until the revision was unavoidable. She knew that. She was going to be here anyway. Not because she'd run out of other options. Not because staying was the path of least resistance. Because the work was real, and the people were real, and she had stopped pretending that being invisible was the same as being safe. And the thing about stopping a pretense was that you couldn't start it again. Not the same way, not with the same unconsciousness. She had been seen, she had done the work that made her visible, and she had stood in the room while it was acknowledged, and she had said what she actually thought. There was no putting that back. She found she didn't want to. The first patient in her section was a woman in her 60s, post-procedure, awake and uncomfortable and trying not to show it. Mara pulled a chair close, sat level with her, and asked how she was doing. The woman looked at her, at the 2 sutures on her hairline, at whatever it was in Mara's face that people had been reading differently these past 3 weeks, and said, "Are you okay? You look like you've had a week." "I've had a few," Mara said. "I heard something happened here," the woman said. "On the news, the robbery thing." "Something happened," Mara agreed. "Was that you?" the woman said. "The nurse they mentioned?" Mara looked at her for a moment. The morning light was on the window. The monitor was running its steady trace. Somewhere down the hall, someone's call light was blinking. "How's your pain level?" Mara said. "On a scale of 1 to 10. The woman considered. 6. Maybe 6.5. "Okay," Mara said. "Let's fix that." She got up and got to work. And the work was enough. And she was enough for the work. And she had stopped needing those 2 facts to be announced to anyone who hadn't yet figured them out. They would figure it out, or they wouldn't. Either way, she'd be here.